But thank you very much for inviting me here this morning. My Cree name is Nigamuna Kakanawenatake. That means songkeeper woman in Cree. Dinanaskamun Tinanao Ikikake Achimiak Egape Achimian. What I'm saying is thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you here this morning. My hope this morning is that the words I bring will help us all in our quest for understanding, acceptance, love, and inclusion, the tenets on which the Gospels were built. I'm only one opinion, but I do hope the words I bring will help us spur a deeper curiosity and a personal understanding of who we are as Indigenous peoples of Canada and why our language is so key to understanding who we are and why we think, how we think. I'm going to premise this by saying that language dictates our worldview, all of us. This concept of language is amplified, especially when it comes to Indigenous languages, because our language weaves its way through every aspect of who we are as Indigenous people, from how we act with the physical world to how we build our communities and how we move forward within our cultures. With this comes very unique perspective, and it's important to understand this if we are going to bring about change. I would first like to recognize and thank the forebears of this territory and their descendants, the people of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Nakota Sioux, and the Dene Sulini, this area known to the Crown as Treaty 6. Also to my elder and my aunt, Enthusis Mary Sinclair, for sitting in support of me here today. I'm glad that your seats are cushioned because, you know, our concept of time is far different from yours. We're not long-winded, we just speak until we're done, so be prepared. Okay, so in the spring of 2011, my husband and I landed at Heathrow Airport in London. This was my first trip across the pond, and I was so excited to see all the sights that I had only imagined as a little girl and had seen in magazines, movies, and on television. As I walked through the terminal, observing all the photos, murals, signs of this unique place, my mind flashed back to when I was a little girl, standing on the western shore of the Hudson Bay, my eyes stretched out far across the water, looking east, curious as to the place that was home to the Pennyworth, the Warksworth, and the Wentworth. These were British freighters that arrived in my town of Churchill twice a year to load up for grain. Now here I was, standing on the soil of the place that I had only imagined, the birthplace of the Rolling Stones, the Moody Blues, the Beatles. Also, it was the home to Buckingham Palace, Big Ben, London Bridge, and of course, Abbey Road. As we approached Heathrow's exit, I noticed off to the side the iconic red telephone booth, and that told me for sure I was in London. Then we walked out to the street, and there they were, all lined up, the iconic hackneys, the little black cabs that run around the city. I was excited to be here. I'd never been here before. We immediately rented a car and started to drive northward to Scotland, where our musical tour would begin. I must have looked like a little child looking out the window because I wanted to take in every sight, every sound that I could possibly take in. I took in the statues, the gardens, the street names, the monuments, the architecture. I drank it all in. We arrived in Perth and had a great time in Scotland. We met some wonderful people, stayed in cozy homes, ate great food. We loved going into the pastry and meat shops and loading up on bridies, coronation sandwiches, and we even tried haggis. Since nearly every town claimed to have the best fish and chips, we naturally had to test those out too. One memory that has stayed in my mind is a day that we hiked up to a huge, empty, unassuming, barren hill to a site that the townspeople proudly pointed out to us was the location of the actual Macbeth's stronghold. We took a picnic up there and we sat and we looked down over Scotland and we could only imagine the history of this place. Our time in the UK was not long enough. We enjoyed all the cultural effects of this unique place, the castles, the moors, the music, the mountains. And when the tour was over, we drove back to London, jumped aboard the jet that sailed us home, I remember looking out the window, now over Iceland, now over Greenland, now over Nunavut, with the Hudson Bay coming into view in the distance. We arrived at Edmonton International Airport and began our long walk toward the exit. Thank you. As we walked, I was immediately struck once again. I was actually now struck by the absence of the cultural effects that would let me know that I was also in an equally unique place. But this airport looked like any other airport that I had been in the Americas. In fact, it was kind of bland. But this was and is a very unique place. It's where my grandmothers, my grandfathers had worked, played, hunted, gathered, traded, celebrated for thousands of years before agreeing to sign the treaties to share the land for all of our enjoyment. A place that had unique waterways, meeting places, and trading systems. But where were the recognitions? Where were the images to recognize the important role that we played in the creation of this country we call Canada? Where were the signs? Where was the language? Where was the homage to a people that gave up so much for this place? It was strikingly absent. I had just arrived home to a place called Edmonton, a name derived from Adelmatone, a name first referenced in the Doomsday Book published in 1086 that recorded the property values of English landowners and the taxes they owed to King Richard III. In this book, Edhelm was referenced because he owned a particular plot of land in England at the time of the royal census. Edhelm means an enclosure. Heathrow, a name to honor the town of Heathrow that made way for the building of the world-renowned airport. Both names, Edmonton and Heathrow, British in origin, give us just a small clue as to why we as First People often feel a lack of inclusion after everything we painfully gave up to believe and trust the words of the Crown. The Cree name for this area is Amiskwachiwaskayegan, translated into Cree as Beaver Hills House. The Nakota Sioux call this place Teota, meaning many houses. My point is to that story that we cannot value that which we do not know exists. Statues and monuments are erected as reminders of significant people and significant events to a society. And it makes me sad that I don't see this when I go into public places. Why are we not there? My 8-year-old granddaughter invited me to her Canada Day elementary school celebration. Grandma, she said, I'm going to be getting an award, a music scholarship. I attended the assembly and I watched as my granddaughter sat excitedly awaiting for her recognition. First, the singing of O Canada. Second, the Lord's Prayer, Catholic school. Then the poems, the songs, and the speeches prepared by the children of all races. They spoke of John A. Macdonald. They spoke of Champlain and Cartier. They knew who Banting was, Bethune, Chris Hatfield. I sat and I waited. I was waiting to hear the recognition of Atikosis, the Cree guide without whom Anthony Henday would never have documented the mountainous gateway to the west, or Matanabe, without whom Samuel Hearne would not have survived an overland excursion across northern Canada to the Arctic Ocean. Tommy Prince, Alwyn Morris, Elijah Harper, Mary Two Axe Early. I sat waiting for the introduction of an Indigenous representative as recognition, homage to the first peoples of this place. I waited, but nothing. My friends, I believe there is something incredibly wrong when somehow there is a normalized thinking in our country that our Indigenous history, our sacrifices, our contributions are not valued enough to visualize, let alone mention. It's okay somehow to leave us out. No one complains. It's just the way it is. This silence, this lack of visual presence and representation is not only not helpful to our relations, it's actually damaging because it devaluates us as an important part of the historical creation of Canada. And this silence, this attitude, is being passed on to our children today. The good news is we can start to do something at a grassroots level, but the problem is far greater in scope. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The year following Columbus's discovery of the Americas, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull, Inter Cetera. This decree basically said that explorers could lay claim to lands that were not ruled by the Christian faith, because anything other than Christianity was essentially pagan, and therefore its inhabitants inhuman. And if the people were inhuman, the land was deemed terra nullius, unoccupied, and could be considered as discovered. But as we know, there were people here, thousands and thousands of indigenous people living across the Americas, living out our own lives, our own economic systems, our spiritual ways. But because our ways were not considered Christian, we did not exist. And here we have the beginning of a long and painful history of loss and assimilation. Governments over time and to this day, unfortunately, still use this tenet of inter cetera issued in the papal bull for land decisions. The doctrine of discovery was also used by European nations to justify their desires to acquire riches and empires around the world, including the Hudson's Bay Company and the beginning of the fur trade. In 2012, the BC Court of Appeal used the doctrine of discovery to justify their decisions to allow logging on Chilcotin ancestral lands. The Supreme Court overturned that decision. I bring up the doctrine of discovery because it justified in the past and does continue to justify the idea, the ongoing idea of dominance and superiority, deeming those discovered as being in need of change. It's ingrained in our political, legal, and educational systems. It has had a trickle-down effect to the point of making possible the Indian Act, legitimizing the assimilation of indigenous peoples. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The first American? No, not quite, but Columbus was brave, and he was bright. Bringing the doctrine of discovery closer to home, Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, had a vision. His vision was to have a railway linking Canada from sea to sea. To accomplish this, Macdonald needed the cooperation of First Peoples. But his government was bound by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Macdonald realized that agreements had to be made with Aboriginal peoples of this country. Thus came the numbered treaties, and there are 11 numbered treaties in Canada. The treaties required interpreters, and a lot was lost in translation. When we agreed to share the land, we had reciprocity in mind. Reciprocity is a foundational, social, and spiritual principle for many Indigenous communities that dictates how all life would coexist in mutual protection, benefit, and continuity. This is the spirit in which the treaties were signed. First Nations had not anticipated that the Canadian government's plan to administer constitutional responsibility by introducing the Indian Act, which was signed the same year Treaty 6 was. These policies shifted the treaty relationship from a respectful kinship relationship to a trustee-ward relationship in which we had no voice, no control over our lives and land. To this day, the Minister of Indian Affairs has the right to my estate as an Indigenous person. One day, when I was a little girl living in Churchill, I was raised by my grandmother and my mother. My grandmother was a very together woman. She was not highly emotional. You know, we looked up to her a lot. But I remember one day my grandmother come rushing into the house, and she was in a huge panic. And this was so unusual for us to see, and we couldn't figure it out. And she started to go around, and she was grabbing bags, and she was throwing her leathers in there and her furs. And my mother stopped her, and she said, "What's wrong?" And my grandmother said, "The Indian agents in town." My grandmother was afraid of being charged for using goods and having goods in our house that only helped us to survive. She had made our muklaks, our mittens. She made our parkas. She made the duvets that we slept on. We relied on these things, and now here she was frightened by the Indian agent. In 1876, Section 86(1) was added to the Indian Act. It introduced the principle of compulsory enfranchisement. This said that any Indian who received a university degree, became a medical lawyer, a medical doctor, a lawyer, a clergyman, or who served in the armed forces was automatically enfranchised. Enfranchisement is a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status. We had to give up our status to become educated. The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. John A. Macdonald, 1887. Thus, the Indian Act restricted us from ceremonial gatherings, leaving the reserve without a pass, hiring a lawyer, voting, owning property. It implemented the reserve system. We don't own the land. It's Crown land held in trust for us, held in reserve. It assisted with the residential school policies, imposed the band system of governance. That is not the way that we operated. We operated by consensus, but we had to adopt the band system of governance. Amendments to the Indian Act have been made to change much of this, but we are still wards of the Crown. I am still a ward of the Crown. We are unique peoples with unique cultures and languages. We have different ways of viewing life, a very strong sense of humor, all based on language that is very difficult to translate into English. We are not incapable of managing ourselves. We've done so for thousands of years. We are clawing at the side of sheer mountain faces to retain what we have left. We are hurting. We've been left with a lot of intergenerational trauma from the fallout of the residential school systems and the restrictive Indian Act. So the question this morning, and I think that's why you invited me here, where do we go from here? I felt it was very important to preface what I've prefaced in terms of the doctrine of discovery and the Indian Act, because it helps us to understand why we have this thought process today and why there is such a silent division. Number one, I would say, begin by understanding. There's a Mi'kmaq term called eduoptimum. It means two-eyed seeing. Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall explains it as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and the other eye with Western knowledge and ways of knowing, and learning to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. It's time for us to find out what we have not been taught. It will help us all better understand each other. I'm going to emphasize this by introducing two Cree words. The first is pisamukan. Pisamukan is the word that we use for clock. We never used to have a word for clock until it was introduced to us. So we had to find a way to describe it. But the non-Indigenous way of describing time is very linear. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes from now. But we didn't think that way. We managed our time by the cycle of the sun and the moon. It's going down and it's rising. Pisamukan, the word for clock, is formed by two words. Pisam, which is either the sun or the moon, depending on the context in which it's used, and uhan, which refers to a tool. So the literal meaning of clock in Cree is a cycle of the sun or moon tool. To us, time is cyclical. It's flexible, it's intuitive, and it's personal. Our concept of time will tell you a lot about us. Indian time. You know, we don't get stressed out about time. We do things when the time is right. We try not to operate by the clock, but that gives you an idea of a word that has makes a difference to us in our translation of it. The second word is Wigamagen. The word Wigamagen is spouse. Its root is Wigig, which in Cree means home. Therefore, your spouse is someone you share your home with. Our language does not make any distinction along the lines of gender. There is no husband, there is no wife, just the one you share a home with. We view all genders the same. Remember that language fundamentally shapes our worldview. This concept is amplified especially when it comes to Indigenous languages. Indigenous languages weaves its way through every aspect of who we are, how we act with the physical world, to how we build our communities and how we move our culture forward. With that, I introduce this unique perspective, Etowuptamunk. It's in our blood memory. Learn to see with two-eyed seeing. Indigenous people are the fastest growing demographic in Canada. Our median age is 28 compared to 43 of the non-Indigenous community. You're going to see more of us in your classrooms, places of work, leisure, entertainment. The world is going to have to learn to interact with us in a more meaningful way. And I think that's what this morning is all about. Until it's realized that we are a people with highly developed, formal set of complex imperatives reflected through our language, our acts and ways will continue to be misinterpreted. How different might it have been if we had integrated principles and concepts from both peoples based on the word share, instead of an imposed system that restricted us from being who we are and has propagated this idea of ascendancy and privilege. The fact that you invited me to speak to you here today tells me that you want to improve things. Go one step further. Take the time to open up your laptops and do some research for yourselves. Take an accredited Native Studies course at a university. Take a Cree language course that will help you see how we think. Find out about Treaty 6. How did it happen? Who were the signatories? Where did it happen? Don't be afraid to look at life, history, medicine, the land, the laws, the language, the sense of humor through our eyes. We have spent the better part of 500 years learning your ways, your language, your education, your systems of governance. It's time for you to take a look at life through our eyes, Etowuptamunk, two-eyed seeing. Number two, I would ask you to question your own biases within your own belief systems. Maya Angelou said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Christianity is only one belief system, and within it there are many interpretations. There are many belief systems around the world. We must learn from each other in the spirit of love, acceptance, and inclusion. The TP is constructed from 15 poles. We believe that this represents the different pathways to the Creator. It teaches us that no matter what version of the Great Spirit we believe in, we all go to the same Creator. We just have different journeys to get there. Number three, speak to misinformation that creates division. We do pay our taxes, income tax, property tax, all the taxes that are there, except on the reserve. We do not own reserve land. It's held in our trust. We cannot buy or sell it. British Columbia has negotiated their own modern-day treaties, so they have far more autonomy over their lands. Number four, do what you can where you can. I called up the city of Fort Saskatchewan to ask what was being done for National Indigenous Day so that I could volunteer. I got put through to one department, which put me on to another department, which put me on to one person, another, and I never did get a clear answer, and I never did volunteer for Indigenous Day, National Indigenous Day. Do what you can, where you can, on your job, in your families, in your community. Without truth, there is no reconciliation. Many churches have now repudiated this doctrine of discovery after taking time to learn what it is, how it has trickled down, and how it has damaged our relations over time. The Anglican Church of Canada, certain Roman Catholic organizations, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the United Church of Canada, the United Methodist Church, and the World Council of Churches. They have all repudiated the doctrine of discovery and are finding new ways to look at Indigenous peoples through the church. Our children are tomorrow's thinkers. Let them know about us, our history, our part in creating this country that we are all proud to live in. Help make our contribution to this country visible. It's the foundation on which Canada was built. Make a concerted effort to view life, history, the future through our lens. Walk with us, talk with us. We cannot change the past, but we can change the future together. It's up to us. I leave you with the parable of the Good Samaritan as told by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. It's about a traveler who is stripped of clothing, beaten, and left half dead along the roadside. First a Jewish priest, then a Levite come by, but both men ignore the injured man. Finally, a Samaritan happens upon the traveler. And although Samaritans and Jews despise each other, the Samaritan helped the injured man. Jesus is described as telling the parable in response to the question from a lawyer, and who is my neighbor? The conclusion is that the neighbor figure in the parable is the one who shows mercy to the injured man. That is a Samaritan. I leave you with Isaiah chapter 63, verses 1 to 3. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to comfort all who mourn, to grant to those in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil in gladness instead of mourning. Thank you for hearing me this morning. I appreciate it. I look forward to us creating a better future together. Thank you. Thank you, Auntie. I'm extremely grateful for Dave. I met Dave about 3 years ago, maybe? Something like that? More? It's been that long, has it? And also Frank, that come out to the acoustic exchange, and I've grown to value these people, and I actually miss them, and it would be nice when we can get back together again, right? So this morning, my husband called me up and he said, thank you very much. He said that the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, I'm sure you've heard it too, found that there was, the way that they conducted the investigation into the death of Colton Boushie was severely scarred, I guess is the best way to put it. And it makes me incredibly sad. I know you don't know who I am. You don't know the life that I've lived. I'd like to, share that with you at some point in the future. The community that I come from and what we've seen over time. And it breaks my heart that here we are in 2021 still experiencing the same kinds of things that I experienced back when I was a little girl in my own family. So it makes me sad. I'm working on I'm calling it my last and final album, not that I'm gonna die or anything like that. It's just that I think I'm going to just put out singles from this point on. But I decided that I wanted to leave with an album that spoke to the things that were important to me. A lot of my former albums have talked about a lot of my Indigenous family and their contributions to society. But this time I'm writing about things that really matter to me, the injustices and how we can hopefully work together to change some of these things. I talk about the treaties in this album. I talk about a number of different issues. So this one I thought I would sing because it's going to be on the album. It's called Blankets and Stones. And I wrote it after hearing the decision in the Colton Bushy case. I was incredibly sad. And lo and behold, 2 days later, we get the decision about Tina Fontaine, that the person that was accused was also acquitted. And it, you know, I thought, I gotta say something, I can no longer be quiet. Another one gone, another walks free. One mother cries, how can this be? No recompense for star blanket sun, taken at the hand of everyone. Bang, bang, blankets and stones. No redemption when a blindfold has holes. Cover up the stains and gallows and ropes. Forgive the doubt in your soul. Weigh it down in blankets and stone. River runs deep. One turns to go, leaving one there sinking below. High cheekbones smile, but out in the night, no one has paid. Can this be right? Bang, bang, blankets and stones. No redemption when a blindfold has holes. Cover up the stains and gallows and ropes. Forgive the doubt in your soul. Weigh it down in blankets and stone. Weigh it down in your soul. Weigh it down in your soul. Your child and mine, ours to defend. Children of life, of innocence. Bang, bang, blankets and stones. No redemption when a blindfold has holes. Cover up the stains and gallows and ropes. Forgive the doubt in your soul. Weigh it down in blankets and stones. In blankets and stones. In blankets and stones. In blankets Thank you. Thank you, Dave.